Hi, thank you for checking out my channel. Um, I plan on addressing philosophy on this channel. And yeah, there's just so much exciting stuff to explore. It's always an exploration. I don't have any firm answers to give anybody on anything, but I can always provide my perspective and my way of seeing things. And that ties into the topic of this video, which is sort of the first thing I wanted to get out of the way. It sort of sets the stage for everything else that I will do on this channel. So the topic is intersubjective truth. What is intersubjectivity and how does it relate to truth? So we have this idea that truth can be viewed in two different ways, subjective and objective. It's assumed that the subjective is inferior to the objective, that we want to escape our subjectivity and achieve objectivity. Yet, I do not believe that objectivity is possible to attain. I think it is an ideal. I think subjectivity hits closer to the actual truth of the matter. We can never escape our own frame of reference. When I say that something is true, that is relative to my experience, my perception, and my inference. Neither my perception nor my inference are infallible. I could always be wrong. Not only that, but the information that I can give, even if correct, is limited by my perspective. I can only give information that relates to the experiences that I have had. And when I deliver that information, it will be delivered in a way that is not context independent. So, relativism is related to this. But relativism has a bad reputation. Why is that? I think, for the most part, it's just an emotional reaction people have to the idea. I see a lot of argument from consequences, which is a fallacy, used in discussion of relativism. It's very common for people to argue against relativism because they don't like the consequences of adopting a relativist position. They feel like society could not handle full relativism. And in some ways, there is something to that. But I think it confuses two things. One is description, and another is prescription. So when you make an argument from consequences, you're saying we should not accept this as a prescription. We should not use this ideology. So it's like saying we shouldn't treat truth as being relative. But that's a should statement. And as David Hume pointed out, you can't get an ought or should from an is. That is from a description of things. You cannot create a prescription. The two are different. Value judgments are inherently subjective. But I would even say descriptions are subjective too. And so the reaction to relativism, I think, is usually irrational. Because it seems to be pretty self-evident that things are relative. But why do I avoid the term relativism? Well, when a term gets dragged through the mud, it's kind of hard to recover it. And relativism is kind of like that. You know, people associate relativism with moral relativism, and they associate it with a prescriptive sense of the term. So if I say I'm like a relativist, people think, oh, so you think that you think that we should just be okay with other cultures, approving of immoral behavior. So, that's oftentimes where the conversation ends, is like, well, you can't tell another society what's right or wrong, because your moral values are relative to your culture. I think that's just a misunderstanding of what relativism is really about. But because it ends up in that dead end, I try to just avoid that word and that concept, you know. So is there a better word to use that sort of conveys the same basic idea, but doesn't come with the baggage of like this moral relativism debate? And a term that I really like is intersubjectivity, because I think it gets more closely to what we are actually doing when we are formulating objective truth. Objective truth is a social construction, and so my view aligns very closely with social constructionism. But even the idea of construction is a little off, because I don't really have to actively construct anything to develop a perspective on things. Our minds do it automatically. So I automatically have a subjective view of the world. I can't help it. Even if I tried to not see things the way I see them, I will always see things the way I see them. And I have confidence in my subjective view. There's nothing wrong with that, and I will present my views with confidence if I feel like I have reasoned through them well. But I'm always looking to compare my subjective views with the subjective views of other people. And that's where intersubjectivity comes in. Intersubjectivity is like creating an empathic space for the development of perspectives. It's very closely related to what John Vervaeke calls dialogos, the art of discussion. This idea that when you bring different perspectives together, something greater than the sum of the parts occurs. So dialogos is like an emergent phenomena. And I think that it's very healthy for us to engage in dialogue with other people. I think that too often the idea of objective truth is actually like a crutch. It leads people to be unjustifiably confident or certain in their opinions without actually engaging with people who think differently. And there's a strong cognitive reason to avoid such discussions, and it's called cognitive dissonance. When we encounter views that differ from our own, that contradict our own, it creates an unpleasant mental sensation called cognitive dissonance. And dissonance is a notion from music. And so dissonance is a disharmonious sound. It's when two notes don't mathematically relate to each other well. So when we have dissonance, we crave resolution. We crave harmony. And in order to achieve that harmony, what we usually do is, rather than trying to integrate the other perspective into our own and contextualize it, we tend to actually just shut out the information. This is where cognitive biases click in. And you can watch people shut down in real time when you present opinions that differ from their own, especially if they're emotionally invested, and most everyone is emotionally invested in their opinions. So creating an intersubjective ethos requires it requires empathy, for one thing. You have to be able to empathize with another person's perspective, and it takes humility, because you've got to go, I may not see everything objectively, so because I know that I'm limited by my own subjectivity, um, I want to engage with the subjectivity of other people to try to gain a bigger perspective, a broader perspective. And to me, like, I've learned so much more just through dialogue with people than I have through pretending that there's an objective standard. Because there is no criterion of truth. You know, the scientific community has done a fantastic job of establishing methodologies for the acquisition and construction of scientific knowledge. But even those are chosen subjectively. You know, the criteria used is not absolute. You know, for instance, I'm a big fan of falsifiability. Like, I use it all the time in my reasoning. Like, I personally try not to believe things that are unfalsifiable. But I also somewhat can't help it. Like, I think all of us believe in some things that that can't be falsified. Um, that can't be formulated in a way that can be tested. And I think that's okay. Like, nobody can tell you, hey, you shouldn't believe this. Like, nobody has the right to do that. At the end of the day, you have a right to believe what you believe. I think honesty just requires us to be open about the limitations of our beliefs, and I think it's very helpful to know when we're believing something falsifiable versus when we're believing something unfalsifiable. And I think we should accord our confidence in proportion to that. That goes back to induction, deduction, and um, and abduction in reasoning. So unfalsifiability is related to abductive reasoning. It's creating a story that can't be proven, but it explains things. And it's kind of essential for mental well-being is to have a coherent story. So we're storytelling machines, and we kind of can't help it. So that's why we should be patient with the stories of other people, because we all have our stories, and pretending that we don't have stories isn't helpful. Um, so there's that, but we should hold our stories very lightly, in my opinion, because they're the least reliable of anything. Is the story that we tell about the information. Um, Induction and deduction. So induction is very problematic. You can look up the problem of induction. You know, proving a universal from particulars. You know, you can't. You can just establish some probability, and even that probability is subjective. You know, and science struggles with this. You know, you have to assume regularity of the universe, and there's no there's no reason to assume that the universe is completely regular at all scales. I mean, as far as we know, it isn't. There are certain regularities that so far we haven't observed deviation from. Um, but even that I'm a little skeptical of, and there's a lot of debate around that. So induction is fallible, you know, but it does at least relate to methodology. You can use a method to test inductive claims, and so that's why it's a little bit more useful than abductive reasoning, his testability. Then there's deductive reasoning, which I find to be the most surefire form of reasoning, but it requires that your premises be good. If your premises are bad, then it makes no difference. You could believe something completely wrong that's logically justifiable in a context, in a logical context. So deduction is really just about consistency and non-contradiction. It just attests to see if what you believe is consistent. But, you know, it could be what they call out on a raft. It could be consistent, but not really relating to anything in the real world. So yeah, those are the limitations. And so intersubjectivity, just to wrap this up, is all about meeting people where they're at with their views and trying to be constructive in the way that we approach conversation and discussion. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll be back next time. Thanks.